of centuries of belief. Let's take a look now at this box on 243, the British tradition, close up on society, and let's pay attention now to this one really quickly. High fashion in the Elizabethan age. A more trivial version of the question what to believe is the question what to wear. For the Elizabethan nobility, however, that second question was almost as urgent as the first. Women and men alike took dress very seriously. Noble women looked like dolls on display, tightly laced into dresses that resembled giant bells. I would write that down. The dresses that these women wore looked like giant bells. Noblemen were arrayed like showy peacocks in close-fitting jackets and wide collars that seemed to serve up their heads on plates of lace. As demonstrated in the accompanying portraits, here to the right, one of Queen Elizabeth I and one of Nicholas Hillard, clothing was elaborate and theatrical in an age that loved the drama and also loved to dramatize itself. Two devices that helped create these theatrical effects were the ruff and the farthingale, both of which came from the Spanish court. Even after the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, Spanish fashions held sway among the English nobility. The ruff was a pleated starch collar worn by both sexes. It varied in size, but as you can see from the portrait of Hillard, it could expand to the size of a large platter. The featheringale was a linen underskirt stretched over a thick iron wire that supported a skirt or dress and gave it the bell shape that Elizabeth's dress has in the portrait. So you can look at that picture and see, notice, you can see where her waist is, and then you can see where the dress goes way, way out around her so that she has a look like a bell. Let's go to page 244. How did writers respond to problems of belief? One true Bible. Let's keep reading. I'm at the top of 244. Protestantism emphasized the authority of Scripture, and to answer concerns about existing translations, King James I convened a group of 54 scholars to produce a new translation of the Bible. So let's put it in our notes. 54 biblical scholars are brought together by James I to make a new translation of the Bible. There would be one authentic, accurate version for the entire realm. The scholars he commissioned to translate the work produced a Bible that remains a standard text and a masterpiece of English writing, page 246 and following for more details. However, it did not resolve all conflicts. Even as men and women now read the same words, they argued about what those words meant. So let's write it down. 1611. We'll obviously have more to say about this later. 1611. The King James Version of the Bible standardizes the English language. A huge moment in the history of the English language. Next heading, the place of the individual. Just as the Renaissance emphasized the glory of humanity and the value of the individual, Reformation thinkers such as Luther stressed the role of the individual's faith in achieving salvation. At the same time, religious controversy could demand an individual decision about what to believe. The new prominence of the individual is mirrored in the literature of the period. From Asprill's complaints in Sidney's sonnet sequence, Asprill and Stella, to the powerful soliloquies in Shakespeare's plays in which characters lay bare the conflicts that tear at their souls, Elizabethan literature turned a new eye on the inner life. Let's look at the next heading, deciding what to believe. Columbus, Luther, and Copernicus never came to England, but they shaped the new worlds in which everyone had to learn to live all over again. It was a time of incredible turmoil. Let's write that down. The Renaissance is a time of incredible turmoil. Intellectual, religious, political, artistic turmoil. In the midst of that turmoil, ordinary people struggled to decide what to believe, how to worship, and whom to obey. The glorious literature of the period gave them new terms in which to think, opening the way to modern ideas of the individual. Please do notice your three vocab words on 244. Petition, a solemn request. Heretics, those obviously holding religious opposing positions to the accepted or orthodox belief. And turmoil, upset, confusion. All right, let's go to 245. We'll take a look there. At 245, the question is, what is the relationship of the writer to tradition? Renaissance and Reformation are the words that define the period. Renaissance means rebirth and refers to the revival of classical learning at this time. Reformation was the reforming of the church, bringing it back to its earlier basic forms. Both went back to older traditions to make something new. Let's look at the heading here now. What did writers rediscover in the classics? Humanism. You want to write this word down? It's going to be a really important one. Humanism. The ancient language of Latin had never gone away. Its study was still an important part of an education. What was rediscovered in this period was not a language, but the purer forms in which the classical writers of ancient Greece and Rome wrote. The classics also offered a view of life different from the Christian version that had dominated Europe. Ancient Greek and Roman authors offered ethics without reference to heaven and hell, and philosophy that was about the natural world, not about the supernatural. They emphasized what it was to be human, so the new way of thinking based on the classics was called humanism. Let's write it down. The reason we call it humanism is because there was an emphasis on what it meant to be human. The next heading, how did rediscovery encourage originality? Translation and invention. The champions of humanism wanted the classics to reach a wide audience. They therefore undertook a series of translations that made the ancient works more widely available while at the same time enriching the English language. English poet and dramaticist George Chapman translated the Iliad, the ancient Greek poet Homer's epic poem about the fall of ancient Troy. Sir Thomas North translated the ancient writer Plutarch's brief biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, and provided Shakespeare with material for 5 plays. Perhaps most important, when the English poet Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, translated the Aeneid, the Roman poet Virgil's epic on the founding of Rome, he used unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. This supple form, blank verse, we want to write that down, was quickly adapted for the stage, and Elizabethan playwright-writer Christopher Marlowe, top of 246, Christopher Marlowe's version of blank verse, his mighty line, inspired Shakespeare to imitate it, and then make it his special instrument. The invention of blank verse shows that, as often happened in this period, the return to older sources led to innovations. Let's look at the next heading, a new form of drama. The drama itself was a mixture of 2 traditions, one native and one classical. The native tradition began in the medieval church and involved the reenactment of scenes from the Bible. These plays moved into the marketplace, adding depictions of the struggles of vice and virtue. Shakespeare probably saw such performances as a boy. Onto his native stock of theatrical representation, the new writers crafted classical modes and models of comedy and tragedy. The result was a new form of English drama. Borrowing and reinventing. One of the most enduring forms of English poetry, the sonnet, entered the English tradition through translation. In this period, writers from all over Europe borrowed ideas and literary models from Italy, where the Renaissance began. English poets imported a 14-line Italian poem called the Sonetto. Sidney, Spenser, and Shakespeare worked individual variations on the challenging form, again, page 241 for more detail, as would poets of later centuries. So let's write this down. One of the significant moments of the Renaissance is when we have Sidney, Spenser, and then Shakespeare writing what's called the sonnet. It is a form of poetry from, let's put it in our notes, the Italians. All right? In religion, next heading. How did writers move forward by going back? Remaking the Bible in English. Translation was crucial to the Reformation as well. When James I came to the throne, it was obvious that the Church of England, in existence for 69 years, should have one recognized English Bible. There were English translations, but none was standard. King James appointed a committee of scholars to make a new translation. Not only did they consult the Latin version of St. Jerome, which had been used in Europe for more than 1,000 years, but working with Latin, Greek, and Hebrew texts, in a blend of the new learning and the new religious fervor, they produced the required Bible, a masterpiece of English prose. Once again, writers had gone back to traditional sources and used them to make something new and enduring. Other translations may now be used in church services, but as long as English is spoken, "The Lord is my shepherd" will be remembered. Also, please do note the essential question vocabulary words: ethics, study of standards of proper conduct, moral judgment; theology, the study of religious doctrines, matters of divinity; innovations, new methods or devices. Let's go ahead now and look on page 247, the British tradition contemporary connection. And let's just read through this one really quickly. William Shakespeare, To Be or Not to Be, and then a rocker. Shakespeare's sonnets may seem an unlikely inspiration for contemporary musicians, composers, singers. In 2007, however, the Royal Shakespeare Company commissioned pop artists to set their favorite sonnet to music, and then you can see some of the surprising results, right? You've got several of these. I'll let you read on your own there. And then finally, to finish that one, for artists and audience alike, the experience proved the timelessness of the sonnets, right? As Merchant commented in Wonder, how could an Englishman writing at the beginning of the 17th century and I have so much in common? All right, let's turn now to page 248 and this reading recent scholarship, Life in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. This is from the writer Sir Frank Kermode. Kermode writes the following. Let's take a few notes. London expanded greatly during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, becoming one of the largest and wealthiest European capitals, essentially a medieval city. Its southern boundary was the River Thames, which was also its principal thoroughfare. To the north was the old Roman wall, but the city was spreading beyond it. Upstream was Westminster, the historic seat of the court and the national government. And across the river was Southwark, outside the jurisdiction of the City of London, and therefore the favored site for enterprises, including theater, deployed by the virtually autonomous and puritanical city government. The population was swollen by country people, escaping the restrictions of rural life and famine, and by immigrants from Europe. The narrow, traffic-crowded streets were lined by shops and workshops, by civic mansions and city halls, of the trade guilds, and by the inns of court, haunts of lawyers and young gentlemen continuing their studies after leaving Oxford or Cambridge. The class system was strict. Clothes were appropriate to rank, whether gentleman, citizen, craftsman, or laborer. Now on to page 249. By the way, our author here, just to point out, Sir Frank Kermode is a literary critic who's written in-depth analyses of works ranging from the Bible to those of Shakespeare and beyond. He's a former professor of modern English at the University College in London and was knighted by Queen Elizabeth in 1991. Let's take a look at this topic called the challenges of urban life on page 249. London was not clean or healthy. Let's write that down. London was not clean or healthy. Sanitation was crude. The Thames was a beautiful sewer. Basically, all of the garbage got thrown in the river. Deadly diseases, plague, malaria, smallpox, ensured a high mortality rate. Cheats, tricksters, thieves abounded. Men carried weapons, swords or pistols in the street. Meanwhile, as the fields and woods were built over, access to country air grew more difficult. Inflation was unchecked, but money flowed freely. Among the expensive luxuries of the day were ostentatious clothes and tobacco, a recent import from the New World. London was perpetual bustle, noise, and display. Imagine how a young man from the provinces, like Shakespeare, might react to it. Shakespeare's Stratford, though a sturdy community with its own guilds and its good grammar school, hardly offered adequate preparation for London, a great port, and the gateway to the larger world. The splendor of the river and the mansions lining its bank won the keen admiration of foreign visitors who compared its magnificence to that of Paris and other great European cities. The next heading, from Stratford to London. In Shakespeare's day, the journey from Stratford to London took 4 days on foot, 2 on a horse. Shakespeare, new to London, probably took time to settle down. His London was the area around the old St. Paul's Cathedral. The theaters were across the river in wicked Southwark. Westminster, site of Whitehall Palace, was a couple of miles to the west. There in ancient halls, the great affairs of state were decided. There the Queen, contented with the Pope and or other foreign and domestic enemies. Later, James catered to his favorites and dreamed of establishing absolute monarchy and universal peace. However, their majesties both liked plays, so there was hope for an aspiring playwright. There was the prospect of pleasure and success, though there was also risk. Perhaps that's why Shakespeare left his family in Stratford to take his place in the London theater and eventually literary immortality. All right? And then speaking and listening at the very bottom here, just to note that Kermode refers to London's perpetual bustle, noisy, and display. With a few classmates, study the picture showing the display at a feast held across the river from the Tower of London, roughly 1570. And then a small group conversation, or at least just jot down a few notes. Notice that you're going to look at certain items, right? A nobleman riding with a hawk on his arm, children dressed like little adults, fashionably dressed people strolling, a servant holding a shield on his back. You'll see some questions on 250 that I'll recommend that you take a look at as we are now getting ready to introduce ourselves to this study of the Renaissance. And we'll look at several Renaissance poets next. Thank you.